So, you want to build a Super Friends deck. There's just one problem with that. Planeswalkers suck in Commander. But you're crazy enough to build a deck around them. So let's get started with why are Planeswalkers weak in Commander though. Most Planeswalkers' abilities are useful in a lot of decks, and are usually fun to play. I mean, just imagine how good it feels to play the ultimate ability of Jace the Mind Sculptor. You get to tell your friend that their library is exiled, and now they only have 5 or 6 more cards to draw from before they lose the game. Well, now imagine that someone did that ability to you. Now I'm sure you can see why people would probably want to target your Planeswalkers once you play them. So, now whenever you're playing Jace or a Planeswalker with a strong ability in Commander, you don't only have one friend that's afraid that you're going to target them. You now have 3 friends who want to tear your Planeswalker apart. And now this leads us into the 3 weaknesses of Planeswalkers in Commander. First, they can be directly attacked by our opponent's creatures, and since we have 3 opponents, we have to defend against 3 separate board states. Second, it takes forever for you to get enough loyalty to actually use their final ability. And third, most good Planeswalkers take forever to cast, most having a mana cost of 5 or above for most of the useful ones. So now let's say that after all of my rambling, you still for some reason want to build a Super Friends deck. How would you make it suck a little less? Well, for starters, we need our deck, and more specifically our commander, to do one of these 3 things. 1. Make our Planeswalkers ultimate as fast as possible. 2. Protect our Planeswalkers. And 3. Cast our Planeswalkers for as cheap as possible. Now you need to decide which of these 3 points you think is most important and choose a commander around that. It's very important to note that most functioning Super Friends decks will have elements of all 3 of these goals in their deck, but choosing one for your commander ensures that you're going to be getting value for your walkers in every single game you play. Now, once you've decided, skip ahead to these timestamps for a breakdown of how these decks usually run, but if you still don't know which point you want to focus on, stay tuned as I go over them. And now the first one of our goals that I'm going to hone in on is making our Planeswalkers ultimate as fast as possible, and proliferating is the best way to do that. Proliferating, for those that don't know, is whenever you get to choose any number of permanents with counters on them and add 1 more to them. So you can add an extra +1/+1 counter to any creature, you can add an extra charge counter to one of your permanents, but most importantly for us, loyalty counters to our Planeswalkers. Now Xavier is a really good commander that helps us ultimate with our Planeswalkers fast. His abilities let us remove a counter from a permanent and create a copy of a token we control, or most importantly, we can sacrifice a creature and proliferate. So with a Xavier Super Friends deck, we typically want to add in cards that make token creatures repeatedly, so every turn we can proliferate our Planeswalkers. Xavier can find a lot of value in cards that can also untap him, which leads to us getting to proliferate multiple times in one turn. And actually untapping Xavier is one of the main ways that we can combo off with him, just by adding a few cards that synergize with him untapping and making tokens. One of the key cards to do this is Intruder Alarm, which states that creatures don't untap during their controller's untap step, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield, untap all creatures. And now Intruder Alarm isn't only a great card on our turn, letting us proliferate twice, but also on each of our opponent's turns, as whenever an opponent casts a creature spell, we get to untap Xavier and retap him on their turn. And now a card that combos with Intruder Alarm and Xavier is Scurry Oak, which states that whenever we put a +1/+1 counter on it, we make a 1/1 squirrel token. So, to start this loop, we would tap Xavier, choosing to sacrifice a creature, preferably one of our squirrel tokens, and proliferate. We would then choose to add an extra counter to all of our Planeswalkers, and most importantly, onto Scurry Oak. And now, since we put a +1/+1 counter on Scurry Oak, we get to make a new 1/1 scroll token, and once that token enters, Intruder Alarm will trigger, untapping all creatures, which includes Xavier. From here, we can keep tapping Xavier to sacrifice a scroll token, proliferate to get a new one, and we can ultimate every Planeswalker we have on the board. And now I want to take a second to go over something very important whenever you're building Super Friends decks, and that is that there are 2 different types of Planeswalkers. For example, let's take a look at these 2 Vraska cards that are typically run in Xavier decks. Notice how both of them have ultimate abilities that are extremely powerful, but in 2 extremely different ways. Vraska, Betrayal's Sting, lets us put poison counters onto one of our opponents until they have 9, which is 1 away from them losing. On the surface, this is great. We can activate its ability, give someone poison counters to make them have 9, proliferate off of Xavier, and then they lose the game. The issue is that this ability only affects 1 of 3 players that we're facing, and ultimating one of our Planeswalkers does make us a pretty juicy threat to the remaining 2 players. Looking on the other hand, Vraska Golgari Queen states that once a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, they lose the game. So in an ideal scenario, we can go wide with our tokens, activate its ultimate ability, swing out to where no one can block all of our creatures, and we win the game. And now whenever you're deck building for Super Friends, it's really important to have both Planeswalker abilities that target everyone and just one person. You have to understand that you're not going to be able to go wide with tokens every game and fully utilize Vraska Golgari Queen's ability. The same way you could find yourself in a game where it's just you and one other opponent, and Vraska Betrayal Sting's ability could win you the game. And now one last thing I want to point out in a Xavier deck is while Xavier itself focuses on proliferating, the rest of the deck really tries to focus on token making. And now this not only helps Xavier use his ability, but it also helps us meet another one of our goals with the deck in protecting our planeswalkers with all of the tokens we have. The only thing that Xavier decks usually struggle with is finding ways to reduce the cost of our walkers or cheat them in, but if you want to find a good way to do that, let's move on to our next commander. Sisay Weatherlight Captain is a commander that lets us tutor our planeswalkers and even cast them for cheaper. Sisay gets to add +1/+1 for every color among legendary permanents that we control, so with all 5 colors out, she becomes a 7/7. Off of its ability, we can play all 5 colors and search for any legendary permanent with mana cost 6 or less from our library. This means that not only do we get to cheat in planeswalkers, but also any legendary permanent that we have in our library. This lets us cast important pieces like the Chain Veil, Carth the Lion, and other cards that really make our deck rolling consistently. Being all 5 colors, Sisay can be taken in a lot of different ways. Maybe you want to throw in a lot of green planeswalkers that make tokens and maybe even gives them trample, that way you can swing in for some big damage. Maybe you want to throw in some isn't planeswalkers that really helps us synergize with the Spellslinger archetype. The main pitfall I see in Sisay decks and 5-color decks in general is just because you can play everything doesn't mean that you should. Try and center around one archetype, whether it be token generation or Spellslinger or anything you want. I would say to really try and pick a deck archetype that fits with your planeswalkers and you're going to have fun with every time you sit down with this deck. Sisay is really one of those open-ended decks where you can just go to EDH Deck or Scryfall, go through a lot of the planeswalker cards in our game, and just pick out the ones that really don't get used in a whole lot of other formats and make a deck around them. And while Sisay is a really open-ended commander whenever it comes to Super Friends, our next one has a very specific deck strategy. Saruman the White Hand is Grixis colors in 1, and it has whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we amass Orcs X, where X is that spell's mana value. It also gives our Orcs and Goblins Ward 2. Saruman's ability is really good at making sure we can protect our planeswalkers. Since all of our planeswalkers are non-creature spells, we get to amass Orcs X every time we cast one. A lot of our planeswalkers in this deck are going to be generic value pieces, letting us draw cards or even taking out some of our opponent's creatures. Another key focus of this deck is throwing in a lot of counter spells, protection, and spot removal just to make sure our game plan can get going and doesn't get taken out by our opponents. A lot of Nicol Bolas cards fit really well into this deck, giving us some card draw, some extra removal, and also letting us even take control of our opponent's creatures. Throwing in some extra cards that force our opponents to sacrifice their permanents would be a good way to go, making sure that they don't have the resources to take us on. Whenever I was building this deck, my main goal was to disrupt my opponent's strategies as much as possible until I was able to swing in big with my Orc army or find one of my Planeswalker's ultimates that could win me the game. This is definitely the hardest of the 3 commanders today to pull off, but in my personal opinion, it felt the greatest to win with testing. Every turn with this deck, you have to make the right decisions with your spells and with your abilities more than the other 2, and have to play interaction to do so, really involving you in the game. And now, these 3 commanders are certainly not the most powerful Super Friends decks, but all have very specific game plans that needs to go off for them to do well. Even Sisay, where you can search up any legendary permanent, needs to have a very specific game plan to do well in games, and can't really just be an all-around good stuff planeswalker deck to have consistent value. Finding the right style of Super Friends deck is extremely important into making sure that you like the deck before you fully invest in it, as a lot of Super Friends decks take a lot of time to learn and can have very long, drawn-out turns that can feel terrible to play through if you aren't in love with your deck. And now I hope that one of these commanders sparked an interest in you that if you haven't built a Super Friends deck before, maybe you want to. Also, if you want a full, in-depth breakdown of how I would build one of these decks, leave a comment below telling me which commander that you would like to see more of. But until next time, have a good one.